The Germans shut down their industrial space. They're not making fertilizer or smelting aluminum or forging steel right now. So it's come at the cost of German heavy industry. And German heavy industry is not like American heavy industry. For us, that's an economic sector into itself. Some imports, some exports, some deals with the US domestic economy. Not in Germany. In Germany, the natural gas isn't just used for power. It's used to make the base materials in the petrochemical system that then inform their entire manufacturing sector. And without that, there is no German manufacturing sector. So BASF is physically dismantling their industrial plant within Germany and shipping it to other places, most notably Louisiana, to tap places where there still is natural gas, hoping that they can ship the chemicals back to their home country to save their economic system. But that would require a build out in Louisiana that happens faster than what the Nazis did during World War II. So we're probably at the beginning of the end of the entire German industrial model. All they've managed to do is delay it just a little bit, and that's largely because of weather. It depends upon the sector, it depends upon the country. The further west you go from the Russian space, the easier it is to make the adjustment because the dependencies were less.
Mm.
The problem with a place like Germany is that the industrial model is one that is the end result of 150 years of tinkering perfection. So in order for them to switch to a fundamentally different model, it has to not be energy intensive. It has to not be based on a worker demographic that is dying out. And it has to not be based on global trade. You don't do that in 2 years. I think actually the weak point isn't NATO. I think the Europeans really have decided to bite the bullet on this. I think the implications are for the European Union. If we no longer have Germany as the industrial heart of Europe, that means Germany is no longer the financial hub that makes Europe happen. Remember that the largest chunk of EU funds comes from Germany. And Germany is not just the German economic system is not just Germany. It's Belgium and the Netherlands and Austria and Poland and Slovakia and the Czech Republic and Hungary. And without the Germans, none of that works. So the Germans don't provide the funding that is necessary for the EU to function. The Germans don't provide the employment that allows the social model of Europe to function.
Mm.
We're talking about a death blow to the EU that's an indirect outcome of the war. I think there's this visceral understanding that this is where this was ultimately going to go. And they are hoping against hope that there's going to be something that happens in the way this all shakes out, whether it's with the Americans, the Russians, or someone else, where they're going to find a way to muddle through. How they do that without the economic model, I don't know, and I don't think they do either. Well, let's start with why we didn't have a famine yet, because it's really, avoiding famine, big deal. Number one, Mother Nature was the kindest she has ever been in recorded history. And every agricultural zone in the world had good weather this last year. Second, the sanctions were designed intelligently. They technically don't touch fertilizer at all. So a lot of the industrial infrastructure in Russia dates back to the 1960s, particularly the petrochemical system that deals with the fertilizer processing. And so we only had reductions of 20 to 40% from the Russian space. And then when the Russians lost the ability to export natural gas, they also lost the ability to export ammonium. So the Europeans, for the most part, have stopped producing nitrogen type fertilizer themselves because they used Russian inputs. So all of that added up to significant shortages in production globally. But everybody had a reserve. And most countries have now drawn down that reserve. So
Mm.
we're entering this year in a significantly worse position than we did last year, but no one's tank is completely dry yet. I've got some very big concerns for this year. When you're talking about places like Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, not the Middle East. So Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Australia, none of them have any phosphate and none of them have any potash locally except for like Chile. So they really are dependent on exports from this region. But we've had a year. And in that year, a few new suppliers I managed to spin out. Normally it takes 3 years to bring a phosphate or a nitrogen facility online and about 10 years for potash. And companies and countries have started to increase their output to incrementally take bites out of that. So as long as the Russian stuff doesn't fall off the market in a hot second, this will be relatively contained. But with Nord Stream offline, Europe is no longer part of the solution. And if we get
Mm.
into the spring and natural gas demand picks back up because of China, then a lot of East Asia can't be part of the solution because they use LNG to make natural gas based
Mm.
nitrogen fertilizer. And the Canadians are doing everything they can to speed up potash development, and they're hoping they can do it in 7 years instead of 10. So we're still right on the edge, and it doesn't take a very creative crisis to tip us into the disaster zone. It's entirely possible. This war is not about economics for the Russians. From their point of view, if they can't reestablish the forward crustal defense that the Soviet Union had, they will disappear from this earth. And they're right. Their demographics are terminal. This was always going to be the last century of the Russian ethnicity. And they feel, and I think rightly, that if they can't forward position, then they're going to be fighting internal rebellions at home because probably now 1 in 3 Russian citizens is no longer ethnically Russian. And the non Russian ethnics have very high birth rates, while the Russian ethnics have very low birth rates. So they really do see this as the twilight of their lives, and they're right. So if we get to a position where the Russians feel that the leverage makes sense, of course they'll do it. But from the European point of view, they're not going to force the issue as a unit, as a European Union. But there's still the possibility that some country, like in Italy or Latvia, will just decide, enough is enough and start going after the maritime cargo. And that'll destroy the insurance picture for the entire region. And that is more than enough to type us into crisis in multiple sectors all at once. Absolutely. And bottom line here, the Russian stuff will all go away and never come back. That's cooked in now. The Russian technological base is weak. Their workforce was hollowed out before they started throwing hundreds of thousands of people at this conflict. They're incapable of maintaining their own system, especially when it comes to energy and petrochemicals and mining. A lot of the growth we have seen around the world since 1992 has been about the inclusion of places that didn't participate in the first wave of globalization into the system. That's Brazil, that's China, that's Russia. If you go back to 1992, there was only one product where Russia was a top 3 producer, and that was oil. Now they're a top 3 producer of over 20 different materials that we all use every day. Without the Russians participating eagerly, this will all go away. The question is whether it's this month, this year, this decade. So we all need to prepare for that one way. Yeah, I mean, food and energy we've talked about, lumber is in there, palladium. Let's say you want semiconductors, palladium and neon, integral parts of any semiconductor fab facility. It's half the global total. So there's just a lot of things we're going to have to figure out how to do differently or how to do regionally if we still want the things we've become used to. Roughly a million. So Russia has 8 million men in their 20s. About a million are now committed to the war, and about another million have left. If Putin is not in power, someone very much like him will be. There was a coup in the Soviet period back in 1982. And at that point, the KGB took over, and that was Chernomyrdin and Andropov and Gorbachev. Putin is the heir to that legacy, which is another way of saying that the only people who are in the political elite in Russia are former KGB officers who trained during the Soviet period. Well, that means they're all in their late 50s or older, and there's only about 130 of them. And they all see the world the same way, and Putin has been able to purge that group over the last 22 years in order to make sure that there are no challengers to the throne. So as long as it's someone from that elite who's in charge,